Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Vadim Ershov and the chilling legacy known as the Fog of Krasnoyarsk. Imagine, if you will, the deep heart of Siberia in the early 1990s. The air here does not just sit, it weighs upon you. It is a time of profound transition, where the old structures of the Soviet Union have fractured, leaving behind a landscape of rusted iron, towering smokestacks, and a silence that feels heavy with the unknown. In the city of Krasnoyarsk, the geography itself seems to conspire with the darkness. Nestled in a valley and surrounded by ancient, rolling hills, the city traps its own breath. The massive aluminum plants and coal-fired power stations exhale a thick, sulfurous haze that the locals call the Black Sky. It is a veil of soot and industry that turns the midday sun into a pale, ghostly coin and coats the winter snow in layers of fine, charcoal grit. As we begin our journey, feel the cold biting at the edges of your coat and hear the distant, rhythmic thrum of the Trans-Siberian Railway as it carries the weight of a nation across the frozen plains. At the center of this industrial titan flows the Yenisei River, one of the most powerful waterways on the planet. But the Yenisei in Krasnoyarsk is strange, a defiance of nature. Because of the massive hydroelectric dam upstream, the water here never truly freezes, even when the temperature plunges to 40 degrees below zero. Instead, the relatively warm water meets the brutal Siberian air, creating a perpetual, thick fog that rises from the riverbanks like steam from a cauldron. In the early 1990s, this mist became a shroud for something far more sinister than the cold. It was in 1992 that the first ripples of unease began to disturb the city's weary pulse. People were used to the harshness of life, the economic struggles, and the gray monotony of the factory shifts, but a new kind of dread was beginning to take root. It started on the muddy, frozen banks of the river, where the fog is thickest, and the sound of the water lapping against the stone is the only company one might have. A young girl, only 16 years old, found herself caught in the grip of a predator who seemed to emerge from the very vapor itself. She survived, a lone witness to a darkness that was only just beginning to wake, but her escape did not stop the hunger that had been unleashed in the heart of the city. As the calendar turned toward the end of 1992, the darkness solidified. On the 28th of November, the atmosphere in Krasnoyarsk felt particularly stifling. The winter darkness had already claimed the streets by mid-afternoon, and the amber glow of the street lamps struggled to pierce the descending smog. A 42-year-old woman, an employee of a local food service establishment, was making her way home. She was a woman of routine, a thread in the fabric of the city's daily survival. She walked through the corridors of concrete apartment blocks, those massive, uniform structures that defined the Soviet era. The wind whistled through the gaps in the masonry, a low, mourning sound that mimicked the distant sirens of the factories. It was here, in the shadows between the buildings and the river, that Vadim Ershov struck with a brutality that shocked even the hardened investigators of the Siberian police. He used a simple wooden stick, a common object turned into a tool of absolute violence. There was no grand design visible yet, only the raw, animalistic impulse of a man who felt invisible in the chaos of a changing world. The discovery of her body the following morning, etched against the gray frost, marked the true beginning of the nightmare. The authorities, overwhelmed by a surge in crime following the collapse of the old order, did not yet realize they were looking for a ghost who lived among them. In the months that followed, the city of Krasnoyarsk began to breathe differently. There was a subtle shift in how doors were locked and how eyes avoided eyes on the public buses. Ershov was a shadow, a former soldier who had deserted his post, carrying with him a mind fractured by the very system that had trained him. He moved through the city like a phantom, blending into the crowds of workers and the ranks of the dispossessed. What the public did not know, and what would not be discovered for years, was that Ershov was not just killing. he was documenting. In a small, cramped room, amidst the smell of stale tobacco and the hum of a cheap heater, he began to keep a diary. It was a meticulous record of his movements, a ledger of lives taken, and the sensations he felt as he did so. Every entry was written in a calm, steady hand, as if he were recording the output of a factory line rather than the end of a human existence. This diary would eventually become his legacy, earning him the name of the maniac with a diary. But in the early 90s, it was merely a growing collection of paper hidden in the dark. The city remained unaware that its newest resident was a chronicler of its own demise, a man who found beauty in the way the blood looked against the blackened snow, and the way the fog muffled the cries of those who encountered him in the night. By 1993, the sense of dread had become a permanent resident of the Krasnoyarsk Krai. The victims were choosing from the most vulnerable and the most ordinary. Young students walking home from vocational schools and elderly women carrying groceries found themselves targeted by a man who seemed to have no preference other than the opportunity the shadows provided. The police were navigating a landscape where records were lost and resources were vanishing, making it the perfect environment for a predator to thrive. Imagine the sound of a footstep behind you on a bridge overlooking the Yenisei, the way the sound echoes and then vanishes into the mist. You turn, but there is only the gray swirl of the fog and the distant, lonely light of an aluminum smelter on the horizon. This was the reality for the people of Krasnoyarsk. Each disappearance, each body found in the forested outskirts or the abandoned construction sites, added another layer to the collective fear. The industrial heartbeat of the city continued, the smoke continued to rise, and the river continued to steam, but the soul of the place was being systematically picked apart. We are standing at the threshold of this 3-year reign of terror, where a simple man with a diary and a hammer was turning the pride of Siberia into a landscape of whispers and closed curtains. Tonight, we listen closely to the echoes of 1992, as the fog settles and the diary begins its first, terrible pages. The wind in Krasnoyarsk during the winter of 1993 did not just blow. It whispered through the skeletal remains of Soviet industry, a low, mourning sound that settled into the bones of anyone brave enough to walk the streets after dark. The Yenisei River, a massive obsidian ribbon of water, never truly froze near the city, kept alive by the warmth of the hydroelectric dam. It exhaled a thick, ghostly fog that crawled up the banks and swallowed the shoreline, turning the familiar world into a landscape of shifting grays and sudden, sharp edges. In this mist, the outskirts of the city became a realm of isolation. The streetlights, few and far between, flickered with a dying orange glow, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and snap back with every pulse of the electricity. Here, where the concrete apartment blocks gave way to thickets of birch and pine, a different kind of darkness was beginning to take root. It was a darkness that watched and waited, blending perfectly with the silence of the frost-covered trees and the rusting iron of abandoned construction sites. Vadim Ershov moved through these peripheral zones with the easy, practiced gait of a man who belonged to the night. To those who passed him, he was merely another figure in a heavy coat, a face lost in the crowd of a city struggling to find its footing after the collapse of an empire. But beneath the surface, a meticulous and predatory order was forming. He did not strike in the crowded squares or the brightly lit thoroughfares. Instead, he sought the places where the city's pulse grew faint. He favored the winding paths that led toward the riverbank, the narrow shortcuts through overgrown parks, and the desolate stretches of gravel near the railroad tracks. In his mind, these were not just locations, they were his theater. He understood the rhythm of the city's vulnerabilities. He knew which bus stops were the last to be serviced, and which footpaths were the only way home for women finishing a late shift at the local factories. In the biting cold of 1993 and 1994, the sound of boots crunching on frozen snow became a rhythmic countdown, a signal that another soul was approaching the edge of his territory. The pattern was as chilling as it was deliberate. He targeted those the world often overlooked: young students walking home from vocational schools, women burdened by the heavy bags of a long workday, and those marginalized by the crushing economic weight of the era. He used the very tools of survival as his lures. A small amount of cash, a bottle of cheap alcohol, or the simple promise of warmth and company were often enough to bridge the distance between a predator and his prey. The air in these moments was thick with the scent of coal smoke from distant chimneys and the metallic tang of the industrial air. When he approached, his voice was often soft, unremarkable, designed to disarm the natural instincts of caution that the dark usually inspired. He would lead them further into the shadows, away from the flickering safety of the distant street lamps, toward the quiet places where the only sound was the distant, rhythmic clanking of a freight train on the Trans-Siberian line. In those secluded spots, the veneer of the ordinary man would slip away, replaced by a sudden and terrifying violence that left no room for escape. As the months turned into years, the list of the missing grew, yet the city remained largely unaware of the singular shadow stalking its outskirts. Ershov was not just a killer, he was a chronicler of his own depravity. In a small, hidden diary, he began to record his actions with the cold precision of an accountant. He did not write prose or poetry, he created a ledger of life and death. He organized his crimes into 7 columns, noting the season, the weapon used, whether it was a sharp knife he called a feather or a heavy stick found in the woods, and the ultimate outcome. He recorded whether the victim had been left wounded or if they had become a permanent resident of the Siberian soil. This diary was a reflection of his internal landscape, a place where human life was reduced to a mark on a page, a statistic in a private history of blood. The methodical nature of his record-keeping suggested a man who felt entirely untouchable, a ghost who believed he could haunt the outskirts of Krasnoyarsk forever without the light of justice ever reaching him. By 1995, the atmosphere in the peripheral districts had shifted from unease to a pervasive, suffocating dread. The women of the city began to feel the weight of eyes upon them even when they were alone. They noticed the way the wind seemed to carry the sound of a footstep that didn't belong to them. They saw the way the shadows in the doorways seemed to move just before they turned their heads. Ershov's territory had expanded, his confidence buoyed by the silence that followed each of his attacks. He began to take greater risks, venturing closer to the residential areas, yet always keeping the dark, secluded woods or the river's edge within reach. The physical evidence of his presence was often hidden by the landscape itself, the deep snow of winter or the thick, tangled undergrowth of the brief Siberian summer. The authorities, overwhelmed by a rising tide of crime in a changing nation, struggled to connect the disparate reports. They did not yet see the single thread connecting the student on the riverbank to the elderly woman in the park. They did not yet realize that the shadows on the outskirts had a name, and that he was writing their history, one column at a time. The year 1994 rolled into 1995 like a heavy fog across the Yenisei River, bringing with it a chill that seemed to settle deep within the foundations of the city. In this era of transition, the very air of the region felt thick with the scent of unwashed concrete, damp wool, and the metallic tang of industrial decay. The grand Soviet machinery had ground to a halt, leaving behind a landscape of half-finished dreams and rusting steel. For the investigators assigned to the growing pile of missing persons reports, the city of Krasnoyarsk had become a labyrinth of whispers and shadows. The transition from the old regime to the new world was not a clean break. It was a slow, painful fracturing that left the police force caught in the middle, struggling to maintain order while the ground beneath their feet turned to sand. Every morning, the detectives would arrive at the precinct to find the radiators cold and the hallways dim, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long, jagged shapes across the peeling wallpaper. There was a profound, heavy silence in the rooms where there should have been the frantic energy of a hunt. It was a silence born of exhaustion, of limited resources, and of a system that was effectively blind to the predator moving through its streets. The hurdles facing the local militia were not merely physical, but systemic and crushing. In the mid-90s, the ruble was losing its value faster than a stone drops in water, and the department's budget had evaporated into the thin, frozen air of the Siberian winter. Officers often went months without seeing a paycheck, their uniforms becoming frayed and thin as they patrolled streets that had become increasingly hostile. There was no money for fuel, leaving the heavy, blocky patrol cars sitting idle in the station lot, their tires slowly sinking into the slush. When a new body was discovered in a secluded patch of woods or an abandoned construction site, the investigators often had to rely on public transport or their own tired feet just to reach the scene. Once there, they found themselves equipped with little more than a few sheets of coarse paper and pens that frequently ran dry in the biting cold. There were no digital databases to cross-reference fingerprints, no centralized networks to track similar crimes across district lines, and no specialized task forces dedicated to the unique, chilling patterns of a serial offender. Each precinct operated as an island, cut off from its neighbors by a sea of bureaucracy and a total lack of communication infrastructure. This lack of connectivity was the exact environment in which a man like Vadim Ershov could thrive. He was a shadow moving between the gaps of a broken society, choosing victims who were often already living on the margins, the homeless, the desperate, and the lonely. In the chaos of the post-Soviet transition, people were disappearing every day for a multitude of reasons. Some fled to the West in search of work. Others fell victim to the exploding gang violence that dominated the headlines, and many simply slipped into the dark corners of poverty where no one thought to look for them. When a woman went missing from a bus stop or a park, her name was often added to a list that was already hundreds of pages long, buried beneath piles of reports on black market smuggling and organized hitmen. The sheer volume of crime in the 1990s acted as a camouflage for the beast. The investigators were so overwhelmed by the noisy, public violence of the mafia that they struggled to notice the quiet, intimate brutality of the lone predator. They were looking for gunfire and explosions, while Ershov was moving with the silent, practiced precision of a man who knew the city's hidden pulse. Forensic science at the time was a ghost of what it would eventually become. The labs were understaffed and lacked the most basic chemical reagents, meaning that vital evidence often sat in cardboard boxes for years, slowly gathering dust and losing its integrity. A blood-stained coat or a discarded knife might be logged into a ledger by a weary clerk, but without the technology to process it, these items were nothing more than tragic souvenirs of a life lost. The investigators had to rely on old-fashioned grit and intuition, but even that was hampered by the social atmosphere of the time. Trust in authority had plummeted. The citizens, fearful and disillusioned, were often unwilling to speak to the police, preferring to keep their heads down and their doors locked. In the communal apartments and the sprawling housing blocks, the silence became a defense mechanism. People saw shadows in the stairwells and heard footsteps in the night, but they stayed behind their heavy iron doors, hoping the darkness would pass them by. This wall of silence between the public and the police created a vacuum of information, one that Ershov utilized to return to his victims again and any again, secure in the knowledge that no one was truly watching. Inside the station, the air was perpetually thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and the ozone of old electronics. A detective might spend 14 hours a day staring at a map of the city, trying to find a pattern in the chaos, only to have the power cut out as the city's grid failed yet again. In those moments of total darkness, the weight of their failure must have felt absolute. They knew someone was out there, someone who moved through the parks and the forested outskirts of the city with a terrible purpose, but they were fighting a war with broken weapons. The perpetrator, a former army deserter, understood the terrain and the weaknesses of the system far better than those tasked with catching him. He knew that if he stayed within the cracks, if he chose the right time and the right place, he was essentially invisible. The investigative hurdles weren't just about money or technology. They were about a fundamental collapse of the social contract. The city was in a state of mourning for its past and a state of terror for its future. And in that transition, the predator found a home. The investigators could only wait, watching the snow fall over the gray streets, hoping for a mistake that felt increasingly unlikely to come. The Siberian air in 1994 did not just carry the cold. It carried a silence that felt heavy, like a thick wool blanket soaked in the icy waters of the Yenisei River. In the city of Krasnoyarsk, the winter sun was a pale, flickering ghost that vanished long before the workday ended, leaving the streets surrendered to a deep, blue twilight. It was in this blue hour that the predator felt most at home. For years, the investigators had been chasing a shadow they could not name, a specter that seemed to dissolve into the falling snow the moment they drew near. They sat in offices where the heaters clattered and hissed, surrounded by growing stacks of paper that documented a nightmare. Every file represented a life interrupted, a woman whose journey home had been cut short in the darkness. But even the most careful ghost eventually leaves a footprint. The beast of Krasnoyarsk, as he would come to be known, was beginning to leave a trail of tiny, almost imperceptible errors. It started with the way the wind shifted. A survivor from the early days, a young girl of only 16 years, had managed to escape his grasp by the riverbanks in 1992. Her testimony was a thin thread of hope in a sea of despair. She spoke of a man who did not look like a monster, but like a neighbor, someone unremarkable, someone who blended into the gray concrete of the Soviet-era apartment blocks. This was the first crack in his armor. The police began to realize they weren't looking for a frantic, disorganized madman, but someone who moved with a terrifying, military precision. As the months bled into 1995, the predator's confidence grew, and with it, his hunger for recognition. This was his greatest mistake. He began to return to the scenes of his crimes, standing just beyond the yellow police tape, his hands buried deep in his pockets as he watched the investigators work. He breathed in the same freezing air as the detectives, watching the flash of cameras and the grim faces of the men in uniform. He wanted to see the ripples he had created in the world. He would go home to his small, quiet room and open a secret diary, the pages turning with a soft, dry rasp. In this diary, he recorded the dates, the methods, and the names he found in stolen passports. He was the author of his own dark legend, meticulously documenting 19 lives as if they were merely entries in a ledger. He did not realize that by keeping these records, he was building the very cage that would one day hold him. He followed the news reports with an obsessive focus, reading the newspapers until the ink stained his fingertips gray. He watched the television broadcasts, listening for any mention of his deeds. To the world, he was an invisible terror, but in his own mind, he was the center of a grand, tragic play. The detectives, meanwhile, were beginning to notice a pattern in the geography of the attacks. The crimes were radiating outward from specific hubs, like cracks in a frozen lake. They began to suspect that their suspect was a man of habit, a man who knew the alleyways and the shortcuts of the city better than he knew himself. The atmosphere in the city was one of stifling paranoia. Women walked in groups, their eyes darting toward every shadow that moved behind a frost-covered window. The smell of wood smoke and exhaust hung in the stagnant air, and the sound of a distant footfall on the packed snow could send a heart racing. It was during this time of heightened tension that Vadim Ershov made the slip that would end his reign of terror. It was October 29, 1995. The ground was already slick with the first true ice of the season. he spotted a girl, just 16 years old, walking through the shadows. He saw the glint of a gold chain around her neck, a small, bright spark in the gloom. He moved in, his boots crunching softly on the frozen earth, his heart beating with the familiar, jagged rhythm of the hunt. But he had underestimated his prey. When he lunged for the chain, the girl did not freeze. She did not sink into the silence. Instead, she let out a scream that shattered the stillness of the evening, a piercing sound that echoed off the brick walls of the nearby buildings. It was a sound that reached the ears of her relatives nearby, and it was the sound that finally called the world to witness his crimes. He tried to flee, his feet slipping on the very snow he had used as a shroud for so long. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man struggling for footing in a world that had suddenly turned its eyes toward him. The chase was frantic and clumsy. He encountered two men who tried to block his path, and in a desperate act, he lashed out with a knife, wounding one. But the tide had turned. A local woman, seeing the struggle, grabbed the nearest heavy object she could find, a fire extinguisher. With a surge of adrenaline, she swung it, the cold metal connecting with the predator's head with a dull, heavy thud. The beast of Krasnoyarsk fell into the snow, the white surface staining with the reality of his own blood. When the police arrived, they did not find a monster of mythic proportions. They found a disheveled man who tried to lie, claiming he was a mere tramp, a homeless soul with no name. He gave them a false identity, trying one last time to slip back into the shadows. But the investigators were no longer blinded. They searched his residence and found the diary, the 43 volumes of evidence that detailed his every move since 1992. They found the knives he called his feathers, and the stolen coats of women who would never come home. As the detectives flipped through the pages of his journal, the smell of old paper and stale tobacco filling the room, the profile was finally complete. They saw the army deserter who had been bullied into a vengeful rage. They saw the man who had turned his trauma into a weapon against the innocent. The trial that followed would be a somber affair, held in a military court where the weight of his 19 murders hung like a shroud over the proceedings. When the judge finally read the verdict, sentencing him to death by a firing squad, the calm mask Vadim had worn for years finally crumbled. He fainted, his body hitting the floor of the courtroom, a final, weak surrender. Though the sentence would later be commuted to life in the Black Dolphin prison, the legend of the invisible predator was over. The snow would continue to fall on Krasnoyarsk, but the shadow that had haunted its streets was finally gone. The damp, biting cold of late October in 1995 hung heavy over the industrial skyline of Krasnoyarsk. The air tasted of coal smoke and the metallic tang of the nearby river, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to muffle the sounds of the city. Vadim moved through the shadows like a ghost, his breathing shallow and ragged after the frantic struggle. His clothes were damp with sweat and the evening mist, clinging to his skin with a persistent, icy touch. He could hear the distant, rhythmic thud of his own heart, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs that refused to slow down. Every snap of a dry twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the heavy silence. He was a man who had lived in the periphery of vision for 3 years, a flickering shape in the corner of an eye, but tonight the periphery was narrowing. The darkness that had once been his sanctuary was beginning to feel like a cage. He reached up to touch the rough fabric of his jacket, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the cold metal of the knife tucked into his waistband, the weapon he called his feather. It was a small comfort, a cold weight that reminded him of the power he usually held, yet even that felt diminished under the weight of the closing night. Near a row of gray, weathered apartment blocks, the silence was suddenly shattered. It began with the sharp, metallic snap of a gold chain being torn away, followed immediately by a high, piercing scream that sliced through the autumn air. A 16-year-old girl was the source, her voice filled with a raw, primal terror that echoed off the concrete walls. Vadim did not run immediately. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen, the stolen gold cold in his palm. But then, the windows of the surrounding buildings began to glow with life. The heavy thud of doors swinging open and the frantic shouting of men broke the stillness. Two neighbors, their faces obscured by the dim streetlights, rushed into the alleyway. The confrontation was a blur of motion and panicked breath. Vadim lashed out, the silver flash of his blade catching a sliver of light as it found its mark, wounding one of the men. But the tide had turned. A woman, fueled by an adrenaline born of protective rage, swung a heavy red fire extinguisher with a dull, echoing thud. The world tilted, the cold pavement rushing up to meet him as consciousness flickered and died. When he finally opened his eyes, the sensory world was replaced by the harsh, yellow glare of the railroad police department. The interrogation room was a small, windowless box that smelled of stale tobacco and the sharp, acidic scent of floor wax. A single, bare light bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the peeling green paint of the walls. Vadim sat in a hard, wooden chair, the legs uneven so that it rocked slightly with every shift of his weight. He looked small, almost fragile, under the intense scrutiny of the investigators. His hair was matted, and his eyes, dark and unblinking, darted around the room, taking in every detail of his surroundings. For hours, he maintained a mask of defiant indifference. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, weaving a web of lies with practiced ease. He gave a false name, his words slow and deliberate as he claimed to be nothing more than a homeless man, a wanderer caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He spoke of sleeping in doorways and eating scraps, trying to paint a picture of a victim of circumstance. But the investigators watched the way his hands moved, the way he meticulously picked at a loose thread on his sleeve, and they knew the man before them was far more calculated than a simple vagrant. The atmosphere in the room shifted when the lead investigator leaned forward, the smell of coffee and old paper following him. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he spoke of the victims, their names falling into the quiet like heavy stones into a deep well. Slowly, the facade of the nameless tramp began to crack. It wasn't through force, but through a strange, burgeoning pride that Vadim began to change his tune. He started to describe the layout of the city, not as a resident would, but as a predator maps his hunting grounds. He spoke of the precise way he would climb through second-story windows, describing the resistance of a wooden frame or the cold slide of a glass pane against his palms. The air in the room seemed to grow thinner as he began to lead them, verbally at first, to the truth. He eventually gave them his real name, Vadim Ershov, and with that admission, the floodgates opened. He didn't just confess. He narrated his crimes with a chilling, clinical detachment, as if he were recounting the plot of a book he had read many times over. He told them where he lived, and more importantly, he told them about the diary. When the police entered his residence, the air inside was still and heavy with the scent of unwashed fabric and old dust. There, tucked away like a precious heirloom, they found his record of the shadows. It was a notebook filled with meticulous, cramped handwriting that detailed 3 years of terror. The investigators turned the pages with gloved hands, the soft rustle of paper the only sound in the cramped room. Each entry was numbered, a cold, chronological list of his 19 murders and dozens of robberies. He had recorded the weather, the time of night, and the specific reactions of those he encountered. Most unsettling were the clippings. He had carefully cut out newspaper articles about his own crimes, monitoring the police progress and the city's fear as if he were a fan of his own dark legacy. Next to the diary lay the belongings of the vanished. Old jackets, a worn coat, and a small stack of passports, their faces staring up from the table in silent accusation. As the officers documented the scene, the sheer volume of his obsession became clear. He hadn't just committed these acts. He had lived in them, replaying them on the page over and over again. Back in the interrogation room, Vadim sat in the silence, his expression unreadable, as the weight of 70 crimes finally began to settle in the small, yellow-lit room. The courtroom in Krasnoyarsk was a chamber of heavy, somber echoes. It was the year 1998 when the proceedings reached their peak, a time when the air outside the stone walls felt brittle with the sharp Siberian cold. Inside, the atmosphere was no warmer. The high ceiling seemed to swallow the light, leaving the room in a state of permanent, watery gray. I want you to imagine the smell of that space, the scent of old floor wax, the faint, metallic tang of radiator heat, and the heavy, damp wool of the coats worn by the many who had gathered to witness the end of a nightmare. Vadim Ershov sat within the prisoner's enclosure, a cage of reinforced glass and metal that separated him from the world he had so violently disrupted. He was a man who had once moved through the shadows of the city unnoticed, but now every eye was fixed upon him, searching for some sign of remorse or humanity in the stillness of his posture. The trial was a slow, agonizing process, spanning months as the court sifted through 43 volumes of evidence, a mountain of paper that documented a legacy of terror. The details were laid out with a clinical, chilling precision. The prosecution spoke of the 19 lives taken between 1992 and 1995, and the 8 others who had narrowly escaped his reach. They spoke of the diary, the small, unassuming notebook where he had meticulously recorded his crimes, a ledger of suffering that earned him the name the maniac with a diary. As the victims' families sat in the front rows, their hands clasped tightly in their laps, they heard the voice of the state describe things no parent or sibling should ever have to process. The room would often fall into a silence so profound you could hear the soft scratching of a reporter's pen or the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the far wall. Each second felt stretched, a slow drip of justice in a city that had forgotten what it felt like to be safe after dark. The impact on Krasnoyarsk was not just a matter of statistics. It was a fundamental shift in the way neighbors looked at one another, a tightening of locks, and a lingering fear that even the most ordinary-looking stranger might harbor a darkness beyond comprehension. On the 10th of June, 1998, the military tribunal prepared to deliver the final word. The judge's voice was steady as the long list of charges was read aloud, a grim litany of robbery, assault, and murder. When the words "death by firing squad" were finally uttered, something unexpected happened. Ershov, who had remained eerily calm and detached throughout the months of testimony, suddenly slumped. His body went limp, and he lost consciousness right there in the dock, collapsing as the weight of his own mortality finally seemed to break through his cold exterior. It was a moment of high drama in a place of deep tragedy, but the finality of that sentence was not to last. As Russia moved toward a moratorium on capital punishment, his fate was shifted. By January of 1999, the Supreme Court upheld his conviction but commuted the sentence. The firing squad was replaced by something perhaps even more haunting. A life lived within the 4 walls of a cell, a slow fading into the gray stone of the Black Dolphin prison. Today, the name Vadim Ershov is a ghost that lingers in the architecture of Krasnoyarsk. The city has grown. The scars on the landscape have been covered by new buildings and green parks, but the memory remains like a cold draft under a door. The families of the 19 souls he took carry a weight that no verdict can truly lift. Justice, in its legal form, is often a cold comfort. It provides a period at the end of a sentence, but it does not erase the words that came before. In the high-security confines of the Orenburg region, Ershov remains, a man who once claimed he had lost the right to live, now existing only as a number in a system designed to forget him. The echoes of those years in the mid-90s still whisper through the trees along the Yenisei River, reminding those who remember that the shadows are rarely as empty as they seem. But here, in the safety of the present, the story reaches its conclusion. The tension of the trial, the weight of the evidence, and the coldness of the cell begin to drift away. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.